blood pounding in my ears, sirens wailing down the street, my hands pushing hard against my father's chest, praying for a heartbeat. You'd think an ambulance screaming into a quiet suburban cul-de-sac would demand a basic level of human decency, a moment of silence, respect for the dying. You'd be wrong, because right as the paramedics hooked up the defibrillator, a manicured hand tapped one of them on the shoulder. The HOA president wanted to issue a parking violation. Subdivisions like Oak Creek Estates are built on a very specific, fragile lie. The lie is that if you maintain a perfect exterior, if you keep the grass exactly 2.5 inches tall, if you paint your mailbox the approved shade of Navajo white, then the chaos of the real world cannot touch you. It is a neighborhood designed for people who are terrified of unpredictability. Nobody embodied this terror disguised as authority, quite like Brenda Hastings. Brenda was a woman who had clearly peaked during her stint as a middle school hall monitor. She never lost that desperate, frantic need to control the movements of other people. As president of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association, she wielded a clipboard like a broadsword. She didn't just enforce the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, she weaponized them. I moved into Oak Creek 3 years ago. I didn't want to live in a place where a woman with a severe bob haircut and a pastel cardigan could fine me $50 because my trash can was visible from the street at 7:01 p.m. on a Wednesday. But the schools were good, the streets were quiet, and most importantly, it had a first-floor in-law suite from my dad. My dad, Arthur, was 72 years old and completely unapologetic about taking up space. He was a retired diesel mechanic whose knuckles were permanently stained with grease. He drove a 1998 Ford F-150 that had seen better decades, let alone days. Brenda hated him instantly. She hated his truck, which she claimed leaked oil on the pristine concrete, though it never did. She hated his loud, booming laugh. She hated the fact that he sat on our front porch in his undershirt, drinking cheap beer and listening to a transistor radio. To Brenda, Arthur was a smudge on the immaculate glass of her neighborhood. She buried us in warnings. First, it was the color of the curtains in his room, facing the street. They weren't white-backed. Then, it was the fact that he parked his truck with the driver's side tire, barely touching the grass verge. Petty, relentless, exhausting bureaucracy. Dad usually just laughed it off. "She's got nothing else, Sam," he'd tell me, taking a swig of his beer. "Empty people need full rule books." I tried to adopt his philosophy, but the constant harassment wore on me. I was cynical enough to know that people like Brenda don't stop until they break you or you move. I just didn't realize how far her absolute detachment from human empathy went. Not until the second Tuesday in August. It was a brutally hot afternoon. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the black asphalt. The neighborhood was dead quiet, save for the hum of central air conditioning units working overtime. I was in my home office, staring blankly at a spreadsheet, trying to find the motivation to finish out the workday. Dad had gone out to check the mail. It was a ritual for him. He liked to walk down the driveway, wave at whoever might be driving by, and sift through the junk mail before coming back inside to complain about the coupons. I heard a sound. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was wrong. A heavy, dull thud. Skin and bone hitting concrete. I didn't think. I just moved. I pushed my chair back so hard it crashed into the wall and sprinted down the hallway, bursting through the front door. Dad was on the ground. He was lying flat on his back, halfway down the driveway, the aluminum door of the mailbox still swinging on its hinges. The mail was scattered around him. Supermarket flyers, a credit card offer, a water bill. "Dad," I screamed, my voice cracking, sounding foreign to my own ears. I dropped to my knees beside him. The concrete was scorching, burning through the fabric of my jeans, but I barely registered it. His eyes were rolled back, half open, staring unblinkingly at the glaring sun. His lips were already taking on a terrifying, bruised blue tint. He wasn't breathing. Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It slices through all rational thought. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my fingers feeling like useless blocks of wood. I dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, robotic, a stark contrast to the absolute terror exploding in my chest. "He's not breathing. My dad isn't breathing." "He collapsed," I babbled, staring at his still chest. Get him flat on his back, the dispatcher ordered. Listen to me carefully. Put the phone on speaker. You need to start chest compressions. I had taken a CPR class 5 years ago. You watch the video. You practice on a plastic dummy. You think you know what it entails. You don't. Nothing prepares you for the physical violence of performing CPR on a human being, especially one you love. I locked my hands together, placed them in the center of his chest, and pushed. A horrific crunch echoed in the quiet driveway. I gasped, pulling my hands back. "Keep going," the dispatcher yelled through the tiny speaker on the hot concrete. "You might break ribs. It doesn't matter. Keep going." So I did. I pushed down, hard and fast, using my entire body weight. Sweat poured into my eyes, stinging them blindingly. I was crying, gasping for air as if my lungs could somehow substitute for his. Every compression felt like an eternity. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sickening crunch of cartilage, the awful, hollow feeling of a chest that isn't pulling in oxygen. Minutes stretched into a waking nightmare. My arms burned, screaming in fatigue, but I didn't dare stop. I stared at his face, praying for a cough, a gasp, a flutter of his eyelids. Nothing. Just the relentless, agonizing rhythm of my hands slamming into his sternum. Then, the sirens. Faint at first, a distant wail cutting through the suffocating heat. Then, louder, turning the corner onto our street. The blare of the horn as the massive red and white fire engine and the boxy ambulance tore into Oak Creek Estates, shattering the pristine silence. They didn't park neatly. They didn't align themselves with the curb. The fire engine stopped diagonally across the street, blocking it entirely. The ambulance jumped the curb, its heavy dual tires digging deep, ugly ruts into the perfectly manicured grass strip between the sidewalk and the street, face stopping inches from where I knelt over my father. Doors flew open. Men and women in dark blue uniforms poured out, grabbing heavy bags and equipment. "We got him," a paramedic said, dropping a heavy canvas bag next to me. A hand gripped my shoulder, firm and reassuring, pulling me back. "Let us work. Step back." I stumbled backward, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. I collapsed onto the grass, my hands shaking uncontrollably, staring at the chaotic, desperate scene unfolding in my driveway. They cut his shirt open. They shouted numbers and medical jargon. They were fighting a war for my father's life right there on the oil-stained concrete. And then, over the wail of the idling diesel engines and the frantic shouts of the medics, I heard the sharp, rhythmic click-clack of low heels on the sidewalk. The sheer absurdity of the moment took a few seconds to process. My brain, saturated with adrenaline and fear, couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. Through the blur of red and blue flashing lights, Brenda Hastings was marching up the sidewalk. She was wearing a crisp, peach-colored blouse and pressed white slacks. Tucked under her left arm was her infamous leather-bound clipboard. Her mouth was set in a tight, thin line of supreme irritation. She stopped at the edge of my property, surveying the scene not with concern, not with the horror of a neighbor witnessing a tragedy, but with the cold calculation of an auditor finding a discrepancy. She looked at the heavy ambulance tires, sunk deep into the pristine Bermuda grass of the parkway. She looked at the fire engine parked diagonally across the cul-de-sac, its lights painting the houses in frantic, strobe-like pulses. Then she looked at the paramedics. They were entirely focused on Dad. One was managing an airway bag, squeezing a plastic balloon over his mouth. Another was ripping open patches to place on his bare, pale chest. A heavy monitor beeped rapidly, a shrill, terrifying sound. "Charging," one of the medics shouted. "Clear." They shocked him. Dad's lifeless body convulsed, lifting slightly off the concrete before settling back down. "Still a systole." The medic read the screen. "Resume compressions. Push another epi." It was a frantic, desperate ballet, life and death hanging by the thinnest of threads. Brenda stepped off the sidewalk and walked onto the driveway. I watched, paralyzed, as she bypassed me sitting in the grass. She walked right up to the back of the ambulance. She paused for a moment, adjusted her grip on her clipboard, and stepped into the circle of paramedics. "Excuse me," Brenda said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a piercing, nasal quality that cut right through the heavy breathing and medical terminology. The paramedics didn't even look up. The man doing compressions kept a steady, brutal rhythm. "Excuse me," Brenda said again, louder this time. She reached out. I swear to God, time actually slowed down as I watched her manicured hand, adorned with a large, tacky cubic zirconia ring, extend toward the paramedic who was currently trying to force a tube down my father's throat. She tapped him on the shoulder. "I need to know who the driver of this vehicle is," Brenda demanded. The paramedic flinched, startled by the physical contact. He jerked his head around, his eyes wide, sweat dripping from his nose. He looked at Brenda like she was a hallucination. "What?" he barked, turning immediately back to my father. "Get back, lady. We're running a code here." Brenda did not get back. She straightened her spine, puffing herself up with the righteous indignation of a minor official whose authority has been questioned. "I understand that you have a job to do," Brenda said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But you have parked a heavy commercial vehicle on a restricted easement. You are destroying the turf. Our CCNRs explicitly state." The spell broke. The paralysis that had gripped my body shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of pure, white-hot rage. I didn't stand up. I launched myself off the ground. I closed the distance between us in 2 strides. I didn't think about optics. I didn't think about the law. I slammed my hands into Brenda's shoulders and shoved her backward. She gasped, stumbling backward on her low heels, her arms flailing. The clipboard flew out of her hands, clattering onto the asphalt, scattering pink and yellow carbon copy violation slips into the breeze. "Get the hell away from him," I roared. My voice didn't sound human. It was a primal, guttural scream that tore at my vocal cords. Brenda caught her balance near the edge of the lawn. Her face flushed a deep, mottled red. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear, with offense. "Do not touch me," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "That is assault. You cannot assault an officer of this community." "My father is dying," I screamed back, stepping toward her, forcing her to take another step back. "They are trying to restart his heart, and you're complaining about the fucking grass. Are you insane? Are you actually insane?" The paramedics ignored us. They had to. They were loading a stretcher. "We got a rhythm," one of them yelled. It was the most beautiful sentence I had ever heard in my life. "Faint, but it's there. Let's load him up. Go, go, go." They lifted Dad onto the gurney. He looked so small, so fragile. They collapsed the wheels and shoved the stretcher into the back of the ambulance. The doors slammed shut. "You can ride up front," a firefighter told me, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the cab. I looked back. Brenda was on her hands and knees, frantically gathering her scattered papers from the oil-stained concrete. She stood up, brushing off her peach blouse, clutching her reclaimed clipboard to her chest like a shield. She looked at me, then at the deep ruts the ambulance tires had carved into the lawn. "The association will not be covering the cost of this landscaping," Brenda shouted over the roar of the ambulance engines starting up. "And I am citing you for the physical altercation. You will receive a summons." I didn't answer her. I couldn't. The sheer lack of humanity, the absolute vacuum of empathy where a soul should have been, left me speechless. I climbed into the front seat of the ambulance, the heavy door slamming shut behind me, cutting off her voice. As the ambulance reversed aggressively, tearing up even more of the sacred grass, I looked in the side mirror. Brenda was standing on the curb, furiously writing on a pink slip of paper. My hands were still shaking, covered in a mix of sweat and dirt. My chest ached with every breath. I stared straight ahead as the sirens blared to life again, speeding toward the hospital. The rage was still there, burning low and hot in my stomach, but the terror from my father superseded it. I didn't know if he was going to make it. I didn't know what the next hour would bring. But as I watched the manicured lawns of Oak Creek Estates blur past the window, one thing crystallized in my mind with absolute, terrifying clarity. Brenda Hastings had crossed a line that you do not cross. She had brought a clipboard to a fight for my father's life, and whether it took weeks, months, or years, I was going to make her pay for it. I was going to tear her pathetic little kingdom down to the foundation. Hospitals smell like bleach, stale coffee, and quiet desperation. I sat in a plastic chair in the surgical waiting room for 14 hours. Every time the double doors swung open, my stomach dropped. Every time a doctor in scrubs walked out with a clipboard, I stopped breathing, waiting to see if they were looking for me. They weren't, not until 4 in the morning. Dr. Gallagher looked tired. He had the kind of deep, bruised bags under his eyes that told you he spent his life pulling people back from the brink. He sat down in the chair next to me, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Arthur had survived the Widowmaker, barely. His heart had stopped twice more in the emergency room. They had to perform a quadruple bypass, cracking his chest open to reroute the plumbing that had failed him. He was on a ventilator in the intensive care unit, medically paralyzed, so his body could endure the trauma of being ripped open and stitched back together. I didn't cry. I think my body had run out of adrenaline and moisture. I just nodded, absorbing the mechanical details of my father's survival. I signed forms I didn't read. I listened to a nurse explain visiting hours, infection protocols, and what the machine breathing for him sounded like. They let me see him at 6 in the morning. Nothing prepares you for the ICU. Dad was buried under a nest of wires, tubes, and monitors. His skin was the color of wet ash. The man who could rebuild a diesel engine blindfolded looked fragile enough to shatter if I touched him. I sat by his bed for 3 hours, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator. Every rise and fall of his chest belonged to a machine. By 9 o'clock, the nurses told me I had to leave, shift change. They told me to go home, take a shower, get some sleep, and bring back his daily medications so the hospital pharmacy could log them. Driving back into Oak Creek Estates felt like crossing a border into a hostile country. The morning sun was bright, bouncing off the perfectly identical roofs, illuminating the flawless lawns. Sprinklers ticked back and forth in a synchronized, mindless rhythm. A woman I recognized vaguely from 3 houses down was jogging with a golden retriever, wearing matching Lululemon. The absolute normalcy of it made me physically sick. My father was lying in a hospital bed, with his chest wired shut, and here, the biggest concern was whether the grass was getting enough water. I pulled into my driveway and put the car in park. The physical evidence of yesterday's violence was still there. The heavy ruts from the ambulance tires had torn deep, muddy trenches through the grass near the curb. A few discarded plastic wrappers from syringes and IV flushes were blown against the base of the mailbox. There was a dark, circular stain on the concrete where the sweat and chaos had pooled. And taped to my front door was a bright, neon pink envelope. I didn't walk toward it immediately. I just stood in the driveway, staring at the color. It was taped right at eye level, secured with a thick strip of clear packing tape directly onto the painted wood. Packing tape ruins paint. Brenda knew that. She just didn't care. I walked up the steps, peeled the tape off with a wince as it took a fleck of white paint with it, and opened the envelope. It was an official Oak Creek Homeowners Association notice of violation. There were 3 boxes checked in heavy black ink. 1. Unauthorized commercial vehicle parking on residential turf. 2. Destruction of association's landscaping. 3. Hostile behavior, physical assault toward an acting board member. At the bottom, in Brenda's tight, aggressive handwriting, was the summary. Your guests parked an oversized emergency vehicle on the easement, destroying the Bermuda grass. You then physically attacked the association president when reminded of the rules. Fines assessed, $500 for turf repair, $250 for vehicle violation, $1,000 for assault on a board member. Total, $1,750. You have 14 days to remit payment, or a lien will be initiated against your property. I read it 3 times. The words started to blur, losing their meaning, turning into jagged little shapes of ink. She fined me for the ambulance. She fined me for the ambulance that saved my father's life. I expected anger. I expected the same white-hot blind rage that made me shove her the day before, but it didn't come. Instead, something deep inside my chest clicked into place. It was a cold, absolute clarity, a freezing calm that washed over my exhaustion and left behind nothing but pure, unadulterated focus. Screaming at Brenda wouldn't work. Complaining to the board wouldn't work. She surrounded herself with sycophants who were just as terrified of her as everyone else. Brenda Hastings drew her power from the belief that she was untouchable. She believed the rules were a weapon meant only for her to wield, a shield to protect her from the consequences of her own horrific lack of humanity. I unlocked my front door, walked into the quiet, empty house, and set the pink slip on the kitchen island. I didn't go to sleep. I went into my home office, opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, and pulled out the heavy 3-inch binder they handed me at closing when I bought the house. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions of Oak Creek Estates. I carried the binder to the kitchen table. I made a pot of black coffee. I grabbed a yellow highlighter, a red pen, and a legal pad. Brenda wanted to play by the rules. She wanted to enforce the letter of the law. Fine. We were going to play by the rules. We were going to enforce every single one of them, and I was going to use her own holy book to crucify her. Sleep was a biological necessity I decided to ignore. The coffee burned my stomach, a harsh, acidic anchor, keeping me tethered to the physical world. For 7 straight hours I read the CCNRs. Most people never read their HOA bylaws. They skim them during closing, intimidated by the dense legalese, the endless clauses regarding architectural review committees, paint color variances, and setback requirements. They treat the document like an end-user license agreement. Scroll to the bottom, sign, and pray you never have to actually deal with it. Brenda banked on this ignorance. She operated on the assumption that her interpretation of the rules was the only one that mattered, because no one else had the stamina to check her math. She was wrong. By 4 in the afternoon, my dining room table looked like the wall of a conspiracy theorist. I had sticky notes protruding from the binder like neon feathers. Pages were highlighted in yellow, cross-referenced in red ink, and tied together with frantic lines on my legal pad. I discovered 3 critical things about the Oak Creek Estates rulebook. First, the document was written in 1994 and had only been amended twice, meaning a lot of the structural requirements were wildly outdated. Second, the bylaws required absolute strict compliance from everyone, including board members, with no statute of limitations on unapproved modifications. Third, and most importantly, the process for removing a board member required a 2/3 majority vote at a special meeting, but any member could trigger an automatic, independent audit of a board member's property if formal evidence of a CCNR violation was submitted via certified mail to the management company. If a board member was found in active violation of a Class A structural rule, they were immediately suspended pending remediation. Brenda's entire kingdom rested on the illusion of her own perfection. At 2:00 a.m., the neighborhood was completely dead. The streetlights cast long, orange shadows across the immaculate lawns. I dressed in dark clothes, slipped out my back door, and walked 2 blocks over to Elmwood Drive. Brenda's house was a sprawling 2-story colonial at the end of the cul-de-sac. It was pristine. The landscaping was perfectly symmetrical, the paint was fresh, and her driveway was completely free of oil stains. I didn't bring a weapon. I brought a digital tape measure, a high-lumen tactical flashlight, and a camera. I stayed off the grass, walking only on the public sidewalk and the asphalt of the street. I didn't want to give her a trespassing charge. I stood at the edge of her property line, pointing the digital laser measure at various points of her house, clicking the button, and writing the numbers down in a small notebook. Height of the front yard hedges, 42 inches. The CCNRs mandated a maximum of 36 inches for forward-facing foliage to maintain sight lines. A minor violation, but a violation nonetheless. Distance of her custom-built stone mailbox from the curb, 18 inches. The county code, which the CCNRs explicitly stated superseded HOA rules, required 24 inches for snowplow clearance. But I needed something bigger, something structural, something that couldn't be fixed with a pair of hedge clippers or a weekend masonry job. I moved to the side of her house, peering down the narrow alleyway between her property and her neighbor, a quiet older couple named the Hendersons. Brenda had built a massive, ornate wooden pergola over her back patio 3 years ago. She bragged about it in the community newsletter. I aimed the laser measure at the outer support post of the pergola, then at the wooden property fence dividing her yard from the Hendersons. Click. The digital screen glowed red in the darkness, 4.2 feet. I smiled. A tight, cold stretching of my lips. Article 7, Section 4, Paragraph B of the Oak Creek CCNRs. No permanent roofed structure shall be erected within 8 feet of any shared property line to prevent fire jumping and drainage runoff into neighboring lots. She was nearly 4 feet over the setback line. Brenda Hastings, the woman who fined me for an ambulance tire touching her sacred grass, had built an illegal, unapproved structure that violated the foundational zoning rules of the community. To fix it, she couldn't just paint it. She would have to tear the entire $15,000 structure down to the concrete footers. I took 4 pictures from the sidewalk, clearly showing the proximity of the pergola to the fence, using the side of her house as a visual reference point. I logged the measurements, pocketed my tools, and walked back home in the dark. The next morning I went back to the hospital. Dad was awake. They had taken the breathing tube out, replacing it with a nasal cannula. He looked exhausted, his chest wrapped tightly, but his eyes were clear. When I walked into the room, he managed a weak, lopsided grin. "Hey, kid," his voice was a gravelly whisper. "Heard I caused a bit of a scene." I sat in the chair next to him, gently taking his rough, calloused hand. The anger that had been keeping me upright suddenly vanished, replaced by a crushing wave of relief. I put my forehead against his knuckles and just breathed for a minute. "You did," I said, my voice thick. "You're not allowed to check the mail anymore." He chuckled, then winced, clutching a heart-shaped pillow to his chest to brace his cracked ribs. "Deal. How's the truck?" "Truck is fine, Dad. Everything is fine." He looked at me closely, his eyes narrowing slightly, as he knew me too well. "What happened, Sam? You got that look on your face, the one you get when you're figuring out how to take something apart." I looked at the monitors beeping steadily, tracing his strong, stable heartbeat. Then I looked back at him. "Brenda came out while the medics were working on you," I said quietly. "She tried to stop them to issue a parking ticket for the ambulance. She sent us a fine for $1,700. Dad stared at me. He didn't get angry. He just let out a long, slow breath. "Of course she did. She's empty, Sam. Just let it go. We'll pay it. It's not worth the blood pressure." I squeezed his hand. "No, Dad. We're not paying it." I leaned back, pulling my phone out of my pocket. I looked at the photos of the laser measurements, the highlighted pages of the rule book, the blueprint of a trap she had built for herself without even realizing it. "She loves the rules so much," I said, locking the phone screen. "I'm going to make sure she lives by every single one of them." Monday morning arrived with a suffocating humidity, but I felt nothing but ice water in my veins. I didn't go to the HOA drop box station near the community pool to submit my findings. That box was checked by Brenda. I needed to bypass her completely and go straight to the machinery that actually governed our subdivision. Oak Creek Management Services was located in a drab, gray stucco office park 2 towns over. They were the corporate entity hired by the HOA board to handle the accounting, collect the dues, and manage the legal liabilities. I walked through their glass double doors at precisely 8:01 a.m., holding a thick manila envelope. The receptionist directed me to a tired-looking man named Richard. Richard was the portfolio manager assigned to Oak Creek Estates. His office smelled like stale print toner and defeat. He looked at me with the weary expression of a man who spent his life listening to people argue about paint swatches. "Mr. Miller," Richard sighed, glancing at my file. "If this is about the fine Brenda Hastings issued, you need to file an appeal with the board. I just processed the paperwork. I can't override the president." I sat down in the uncomfortable vinyl chair opposite his desk. I didn't smile. "I'm not here to appeal," I said, sliding the manila envelope across his desk. "I'm here to trigger an automatic property audit of a sitting board member, as outlined in Article 12, Section 3 of the Oak Creek Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. I have documented 3 structural violations on the property of Brenda Hastings. including a Class A zoning violation regarding a permanent structure built over the county setback line. Richard stopped shuffling his papers. He looked at the envelope, then slowly up at me. "Excuse me?" "Open it," I told him. He did. He pulled out the high-gloss photographs, the laser measurement logs, and the highlighted printouts of the county fire codes. I watched his eyes scan the documents. I saw the exact moment his bureaucratic apathy shifted into genuine, liability-induced panic. "She built a $15,000 pergola 4 feet from the property line," I said, keeping my voice level and quiet. "The CCNRs require an 8-foot setback to prevent fire jumping. She never submitted an architectural variance request because she knew it would be denied. If a fire starts on her patio, it jumps to the neighbor's roof in under 3 minutes. You represent the management company. Now that you have been formally notified with photographic evidence of a fire code violation, your corporate liability insurance requires you to act. If you don't, and that structure causes property damage, I will subpoena this conversation." Richard swallowed hard. He looked at the pictures again. He knew I had him cornered. "What exactly do you want, Mr. Miller?" he asked nervously. "The bylaws state that any board member found in active, documented violation of a Class A structural rule is immediately suspended from their duties pending an independent audit and remediation," I replied, quoting the text from memory. "I want her suspended. Today. I want the certified letter sent to her house, and I want a special meeting called for a vote of no confidence." Richard wiped a thin sheen of sweat from his upper lip. "Oh, I have to send an independent inspector out to verify these measurements before we issue a suspension." "Send them," I said, standing up. "They'll find exactly what I found. Have a good morning, Richard." Driving back to the neighborhood, the cynical part of my brain knew that suspending Brenda wouldn't be enough. She would fight it. She would claim ignorance or try to retroactively approve her own variance. I needed to strip away the foundation of her power, the apathy of the neighborhood. I parked in my driveway and walked straight across the street, heading for the Hendersons' house. Tom Henderson opened the door. He was a retired postal worker in his late 60s, a quiet man who spent most of his time meticulously tending to his tomato garden. He looked surprised to see me. "Sam," he said, opening the screen door. "We heard about Arthur. Martha and I have been praying for him. How's he doing?" "He's tough, Tom. He's going to make it," I said. I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Tom, can I come in for a minute? I need to show you something." We sat in their floral-patterned living room. Martha brought out iced tea. I didn't waste time with small talk. I pulled out a duplicate set of the pergola photographs and set them on the coffee table. "Brenda fined me $1,700 because the ambulance that saved my dad parked on the grass," I said flatly. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tom's jaw tightened. "That woman is the devil," he muttered. "I'm so sorry, Sam. She fined us $200 last month because our garden hose was visible from the street. She's been bullying us for years, Tom. But she's not untouchable." I pointed to the photographs. "That pergola she built in her backyard, it's illegal. It's 4 feet from your shared fence. Did you know that if she has a grease fire on her grill, it will catch your roof on fire before the fire department even gets down the street?" Tom stared at the pictures, his brow furrowing deeply. "More importantly," I continued, leaning forward, "did you know that because her structure violates the county fire setback, if a fire does happen, your homeowner's insurance might deny the claim because you allowed an illegal hazard to exist adjacent to your property?" That was the kill shot. Tom's face went pale, then flushed with a deep, slow-burning anger. "I didn't know," Tom whispered, his hands curling into fists on his knees. "She told us it was all approved. She said she had permits." "She lied," I said. "I filed the paperwork to have her suspended from the board, but I need to call a special meeting to vote her out permanently. To do that, I need signatures from 20% of the homeowners. I need people to stop being afraid of her clipboard." Tom looked at his wife. Martha nodded, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. "Where do I sign?" Tom asked. I handed him the petition. It was the first domino. Over the next 3 days, I didn't go to work. I took a leave of absence. I spent my mornings at the hospital with Dad, watching him slowly regain his color, and my afternoons knocking on doors. Oak Creek Estates was a powder keg of silent resentment. Everyone had a Brenda story. Everyone had been fined for a trash can, a slightly faded mailbox, a stray weed in the driveway cracks. They were just waiting for someone to light the match. I didn't just ask for signatures. I showed them the pictures of the pergola. I showed them the hypocrisy. The illusion of her perfection shattered the moment they saw the tape measure proving she felt the rules didn't apply to her. By Thursday evening, I didn't have 20% of the neighborhood. I had 60%. Friday afternoon brought a shift in the atmospheric pressure of Oak Creek Estates. You could almost feel it in the air. I was sitting on my front porch, drinking a cheap beer in honor of my dad, watching the street. The independent inspector from the management company had come and gone on Wednesday. I had watched him from my office window, measuring the pergola, shaking his head and driving away. At exactly 2:15 p.m., a white USPS truck pulled up to Brenda's mailbox. The mail carrier didn't just drop letters in the box. He walked up to her front door with a signature pad. Certified mail. I took a slow sip of my beer. 10 minutes later, Brenda Hastings burst out of her front door. She wasn't wearing her crisp slacks or a pastel cardigan. She was wearing baggy sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt. Her severe bob was disheveled. She was clutching a thick stack of papers in her right hand, marching down the sidewalk with a frantic, unhinged energy. She didn't walk toward the management office. She walked straight toward my house. I didn't stand up. I stayed seated in Dad's old lawn chair, resting the cold aluminum can on my knee. Brenda crossed my property line, stomping over the dead grass where the ambulance had parked, and stopped at the base of the porch steps. Her face was contorted with a rage so profound she was actually trembling. "What did you do?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "I'm having a beer, Brenda. It's a nice afternoon," I replied evenly. She slammed the stack of papers against the wooden railing of my porch. "I received a letter from management. They are suspending my presidency. They are demanding I demolish my patio structure. You did this. Article 7, Section 4, Paragraph B," I recited, looking her dead in the eye. "No permanent roofed structure shall be erected within 8 feet of any shared property line. You're 4.2 feet from the Henderson's fence. It's a fire hazard. The rules are the rules." "I am the president of this association," she screamed, abandoning any pretense of neighborhood decorum. Saliva flew from her lips. "I have invested my life into keeping this community pristine. You are a petty, vindictive little man, and I will sue you for harassment. I will put a lien on this house so fast you'll be on the street." "You aren't the president right now," I reminded her calmly. "You're suspended pending remediation, which means you have no authority to issue liens, collect fines, or enforce CC&Rs. She grabbed the porch railing, her knuckles turning white. "You think you're so smart? You think you can tear down everything I built because you were embarrassed about a little parking ticket?" That was it. The absolute staggering delusion. I stood up. I didn't rush her. I walked slowly to the edge of the porch, looking down at her. The freezing calm in my chest was absolute. "A little parking ticket," I repeated, my voice dropping an octave. "My father was dead on this concrete. He was clinically dead. I was breaking his ribs, trying to keep blood flowing to his brain, and you tried to stop the paramedics to write a citation. You didn't see a dying man, Brenda. You saw a rule violation. You are completely hollow." She flinched. For a fraction of a second, the self-righteous anger faltered, replaced by a flicker of something that looked dangerously like shame. But she buried it instantly, her face hardening into a mask of pure spite. "Your father's health is not an excuse to violate community standards," she sneered. "And your community standards are not an excuse to build an illegal fire hazard," I shot back. "Demolition requires a permit from the county, by the way. I checked. You have 30 days to remove the pergola and restore the landscaping at your own expense. If you don't, the management company will hire contractors to do it and bill you for the labor. Read the bylaws. It's all in there." "I will fight this," she practically growled. "I have lawyers." "So does the management company," I said, deep. "And they hate liability more than they hate you." I reached into my back pocket, pulled out the folded pink envelope she had taped to my door, and dropped it onto the grass at her feet. "I'm not paying the $1,700, I told her. And the special election to permanently remove you from the board is scheduled for next Thursday. We have the signatures. It's over, Brenda. Go home. She looked down at the pink envelope in the grass. Then she looked around the street. The commotion had not gone unnoticed. Tom Henderson was standing on his porch, watching. The woman with the Lululemon and the golden retriever had stopped on the sidewalk 2 houses down, blatantly staring. A man across the street, who Brenda had fined for having the wrong color mulch, was leaning against his car, arms crossed, smiling grimly. The invisible armor she had worn for years was gone. The neighborhood was watching her unravel, and no one was looking away. The fear was dead. Brenda looked back at me. Her chest heaved. She tried to find something to say, a final threat to hurl, but the ammunition was gone. She was just a woman standing in a driveway with an illegal pergola and a suspension notice. She turned around and walked away. She didn't march. She didn't click-clack with authority. She walked with a stiff, humiliated gait, staring straight ahead as she passed the neighbors who had finally stopped bowing to her. I sat back down in Dad's chair. I picked up my beer. It was warm, but it tasted better than anything I had ever drank in my life. The bureaucratic war was won, but the physical dismantling of Brenda Hastings's ego was just about to begin. The demolition crews were going to be loud, and I planned to sit on the porch and watch every single swing of the sledgehammer. Thursday night felt like a localized tectonic shift. The special meeting was held in the fluorescently lit gymnasium of the local elementary school. The squeaky linoleum floor and the smell of old floor wax completely stripped away any remaining veneer of Brenda's suburban authority. She didn't sit at the head table alongside Richard from the management company. She sat alone in the front row of the folding chairs, rigid, clutching a manila folder, staring straight ahead at a retracted basketball hoop. Richard looked terrified. He kept wiping his brow with a crumpled tissue. The gymnasium was packed to capacity. People who hadn't spoken to their neighbors in years, who usually communicated only through passive-aggressive waves from moving vehicles, were huddled together. They were murmuring in low, excited voices, clutching their own violation notices, like admission tickets. The vote was an absolute slaughter. You needed a 2/3 majority to recall a board president. We got 92%. When Richard read the final tally into the cheap, echoing PA system, there was no cheering. It wasn't a sports game. There was no locker room celebration. It was just a collective, heavy exhalation of a neighborhood that had finally stopped holding its breath. Brenda stood up before Richard even finished his sentence. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't offer a defense. She just turned and walked out the double doors, the loud clack of her low heels echoing off the cinder block walls, fading into the humid night. By Monday morning, a flatbed truck towing a Bobcat skid steer loader parked on Elmwood Drive. I made a pot of black coffee and walked down the street. I didn't hide behind a curtain. I stood right on the public sidewalk across from her house, holding a ceramic mug, watching the heavy machinery unload. Tom Henderson was already out there, pretending to aggressively prune a rosebush that didn't need pruning. He gave me a curt nod, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Other neighbors slowly trickled out, fetching newspapers they had already read, lingering near their mailboxes. 3 men in neon yellow safety vests walked into Brenda's backyard, carrying reciprocating saws, crowbars, and heavy sledgehammers. Demolition is an ugly, violent process. It doesn't care about aesthetics or property values. The first screech of the saw blade biting into the heavy cedar posts of her illegal pergola ripped through the quiet morning. Then came the rhythmic, bone-rattling thuds of the sledgehammers breaking apart the custom stone footers. Dust plumed high into the air, drifting lazily over the immaculate emerald lawn she guarded with religious fervor, coating her pristine windows in a layer of grit. I saw her face in the upstairs bedroom window. She was standing behind the glass, half hidden by a curtain, watching the physical destruction of her monument to herself. For a second, a fleeting heartbeat of time, I felt a microscopic twinge of pity. It was pathetic, really. Her entire identity, her whole sense of worth, was wrapped up in policing other people's lives to avoid looking at the glaring emptiness of her own. But then I remembered the suffocating weight of my hands pushing down on my father's chest. I remembered the sickening crunch of his ribs, the blue tint of his dying lips, and her manicured hand tapping a paramedic to ask about the goddamn grass. The pity evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, hard, unyielding satisfaction. The crew took 4 hours to tear it down. They tossed the splintered cedar planks and jagged chunks of concrete into a massive roll-off dumpster parked in her driveway. The heavy steel wheels of the dumpster left deep, ugly gouges in her perfect asphalt. When they finally drove away, leaving behind a scarred patch of raw dirt and torn grass where the pergola used to stand, the neighborhood felt physically different. Lighter. The air was easier to breathe. 2 weeks later, I brought Dad home. The drive from the cardiac ward was agonizingly slow. Every bump, every pothole in the road made him wince, his chest still healing from the brutal, invasive surgery that saved him. But he was alive. He was breathing on his own. He was complaining bitterly about the hospital food and the television channels, which was the best, most reliable indicator that his soul was entirely intact. I pulled into the driveway and carefully put the truck in park. I hadn't pressure washed the concrete. The faint, dark stain where the medical chaos had unfolded was still there, baked into the stone by the August sun. Dad looked at it through the windshield for a long time. The engine clicked as it cooled. He didn't say anything. He just reached over and squeezed my shoulder with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a man who had just had his chest cracked open. I got out, walked around, and helped him out of the cab, supporting his weight as we slowly walked up the incline of the driveway. "Looks like a damn war zone," he rasped, looking down at the dead, muddy patch of grass where the heavy ambulance tires had chewed up the parkway. "I'll reseed it this weekend," I told him, keeping a steady arm around his waist, watching his steps. "Get some topsoil down." "Don't you dare." Dad stopped. He leaned heavily against me, pointing a shaky, age-spotted finger at the ruined dirt. "You leave it exactly like that. It's a monument." I looked at him, surprised by the firmness in his raspy voice. "A monument to what?" "To not giving a damn about the grass when it actually matters," he said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his pale face, settling into the deep lines around his eyes. "And to you, kid, for not letting them pave over us. Now get me inside before Brenda writes us up for loitering." We walked inside. The house smelled a little stale from being empty, but it was quiet. The oppressive, panopticon-like feeling of being constantly watched by the neighborhood association was gone. The interim board, comprised mostly of people who actually had day jobs and didn't care about the exact shade of your mailbox, had immediately dismissed all outstanding fines related to the medical emergency with a formal apology letter. I got Dad settled into his worn recliner in the living room, surrounded by his amber pill bottles, the television remote, and a fresh glass of ice water. He fell asleep within minutes, the soft, steady rhythm of his breathing filling the quiet room. I walked into my home office. I looked at the thick, heavy binder containing the Oak Creek Estate's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. It was still sitting on my desk, bristling with neon sticky notes and frantic highlighters. The weapon I had used to dismantle a tyrant. I picked it up, feeling the heavy weight of the glossy paper. I walked out to the kitchen, opened the cabinet under the sink, and dropped it straight into the trash can. We didn't need it anymore. We were just people living in houses now. The fragile, perfect lie of the subdivision was broken, and reality had finally moved in. It was messy. It had tire tracks on the lawn, and it was beautiful. Suburban dictators rely on your silence to maintain their power. They weaponize the rules because they know most people are too exhausted by life to fight back. But exhaustion has a limit, and no clipboard is a match for a family backed into a corner. If watching Brenda's illegal pergola get torn to splinters brought a smile to your face, hit the like button and share this video with anyone currently fighting their own neighborhood tyrant. Don't let them win. Subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below. Tell me the most unhinged thing your HOA has ever tried to pull. I read every single one.